Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you that you've given us your Holy Spirit, and that we can look to you for our guidance and our strength. And just thank you, Lord, for this time that we can share together. I pray that we might discern your will, and discern your thoughts. Just pray that you will watch over each person. Please just give protection and guidance and health. Thank you, Lord, just for the work that each one here is doing in the various parts of the world, and just pray that you would give wisdom and guidance. Help each one of us, Lord, as they're working on projects, and just pray that they will bring honor and glory to your name. Just pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's see. All right. What we're going to work on today is the purpose statement section of the proposal. Before we get into that, let me just ask you for any comments or thoughts that you may have in terms of the work you've been doing so far. Any questions or comments or anything you'd like to ask at this point before we get into other presentations?
Good morning, Dr. Payne. This is Celicia.
Good morning, Celicia.
I would kindly ask if you can just review the context. I'm still to complete that for week 2. I think I've kind of lost my way after writing little about the problem statement. So if I can just get just a nudge in that direction. I've read what you've written,
Okay.
but if you can just maybe just...
Yeah. The context section is to help the reader understand the environment where you're working on a particular problem. The way I think I put it in the template is that we're really trying to help the reader understand the people that you're working with, and just all the different facets of...
You're muted.
So sorry about that. It looks like the internet connection is not liking our snow this morning. So hopefully I will be able to stay connected. Anyway, we were talking about the context, and I was saying it's really trying to help the reader understand the people and all the various facets of the people, who they are, the location, the environment, any significant issues you'd like to talk about in terms of that location, some of the demographics in terms of to help the reader just know the people. That's the main purpose, is to help people have a little bit of background so they can maybe understand the problem. I think what we've normally said is kind of help a person understand the location, some of the geography that might be helpful for people to understand your particular situation. Worldview, I didn't mention that, but that's another issue that we've really tried to focus on, that each project is done with people that have a particular worldview, a particular culture. And so I think those are some of those important factors that need to be addressed within that context section. And then I think we've also asked you to kind of talk about the audience, who it is that you're writing this project to. And so that could also be a part of that context section. So that's about what I can say at this point. Anybody else can add anything to the context section? Okay.
Dr. Payne, this is Siobhan.
Go ahead, Siobhan.
Yesterday, I know when we spoke about my context section, you also suggested, based on my narrative of the Father's blessing and my own experience in that view, that maybe I include the personal component of the context as I'm not sure if it would be more of a springboard or just to provide a backdrop on the prompting of why I'm doing the project.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. That's good point. Yeah, sometimes a person would like to include their own personal context, and I think that's appropriate in the context section to help the reader understand maybe what your involvement is in relationship to the situation there. Siobhan, we were talking yesterday about the place of fathering and parenting in the life of children, and Siobhan was just talking about her own life that probably helped a little bit give a little clarity in terms of what she's doing and what her life has been like within a particular family setting. So yeah, I think that's appropriate for that context section.
Bill, if I may interject,
Go ahead.
Does everybody know how to describe a worldview, or what framework to use to describe your worldview?
That might be helpful, Dr. Anu, since you've talked to us a lot about that. Maybe you could just give a few comments on that issue.
You know what I'm suggesting? I'm going to send you some documentation,
okay,
in order not to waste your time.
Okay.
And so that you can perhaps just make it available to students. And I'm willing to interact individually because I don't want to take too much time.
Okay.
If I start on that, I'm not finished yet.
Yeah. No, that'd be great. Yeah, we can post that in the classroom. That would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Dr. Payne, I have some questions.
Go ahead, Anthony.
Relative to theoretical framework, I'm kind of back to that. It keeps haunting me as I move forward, and maybe I need to talk to you one-on-one. But a question I think might be relevant for the whole class is: does theoretical framework, does it in the better, more focused dissertations, does it tend to be singular? Does it tend to be plural? Does it tend to be multiple? Because as I labor in my effort, it feels like there's legs of perhaps 4 or 5 theoretical frameworks that my project could be contained within, that it might reference. And I'm wondering, so I'm asking, I guess, what is normal, if there is a normal? And secondly, I'm asking if you're touching too many theoretical frameworks, is that a danger sign? Is that a warning sign that you need to focus a little more on which one of those theoretical frameworks you want to interface with?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Good observation. And I'll let others speak about that issue too. But at least from my perspective, a theoretical framework, like we've said, is the, we've used the word theories, and we've talked about that word theory because, as you look up the definition of theory, sometimes you can find 2 contrasting definitions. One definition of a theory is a series of principles, concepts that are being hypothesized, but still need to be proven in some way. And I think that's what has sometimes caused some confusion. The other definition of theory, though, that is used in the context of dissertations is that a theory is a set of principles, concepts, constructs, is the way the literature often puts it, that have been proven and somewhat accepted within the academic community, by which we can make predictions, we can make some determinations about outcomes, and it just can give us a framework in which we are discussing our whole project. Now, that being said, and as you look at the literature, there's sometimes disagreement, okay, on what a theoretical framework is. Some have called it a conceptual framework, some call it a theoretical framework. We're using the term theoretical because we think it encompasses a broader context. But, you know, there's going to be okay, in your case, you know, you're working with planning within the church, and you come from the healthcare industry, and you're looking to bring some concepts from the healthcare planning, and we could call that a theoretical framework. It's a framework of concepts and principles that have been used, say, in the health industry that have been accepted, okay? That's a model. I think, if I remember correctly, you would like to take some of those thoughts and apply them to the church planning context. Okay, so now that's to me, that's a part of your theoretical framework, okay? That's the context. Yeah, you could get into a lot of other sub-points in that. You could talk about asset-based community development if you were going to use that as a piece of your project. That would be you know, a sub-point in terms of a theoretical framework. You could be talking about appreciative inquiry if you were going to use that as another piece. But you know, you've got one big piece, which is the whole concept of planning, strategic planning. You know, that's a big concept that is part of a theoretical framework. In a BGU dissertation, though, there's also a theological component in the framework. And so that would be another, the way I look at it, that would be another piece of your theoretical framework. And so we now include, you know, a theological section within the literature review, which is talking about some of the biblical concepts that seem to be relevant to your setting. So I guess trying to answer your question, there's probably going to be one big component. Oh, I'm going to say there's two big components. There's one big component in terms of, I don't like to use the word non-biblical. Like say in your case, we're talking about, you know, planning, strategic planning. That's a big part of your framework. And then there's going to be some theological concepts that we could pull out, you know, in terms of examples of planning. So yeah, I doubt that you're going to have, you know, several parts of the theoretical framework. You know, I would probably want to confine that to maybe 2, 3, MS4. There could be, you know, and those components are going to be the subsections in your literature reviews, so that your reader, it gives a place where you can begin to talk about some of those theoretical concepts, frameworks that are integral to your particular project.
Thank you. I didn't want to take all our time. I wanted to touch on that and get a big answer. And I may set up a time to tell you a little more about what's going on, and maybe you could give me a little guidance that might be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great, because it's usually easier to try to contextualize it into your particular situation.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into today's material. Let me share my screen for a moment. Just looking at the comments section, make sure there's nothing we should be answering there. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, this is the document, and I just wanted to kind of highlight a few things here for this week on purpose statement. Like we've said, you know, a purpose statement is kind of again, it's a summary. It's, you know, everything in the introduction chapter is generally a summary, because you'll deal with some of these issues a little more in detail in other parts of the proposal. But you know, the purpose statement of your section summarizes, you know, why you want to do the project, what you intend to do, and you're going to have some research questions that you're going to be talking about in this section. So if we look at the purpose statement section, it's good to begin that with kind of a couple of paragraphs. I call it the intent, okay, and it's kind of the introduction to this section. Again, why you want to do the study, the type of research you're wanting to do, and a summary of the theoretical framework. Okay, now this would be one place I think that would be good to summarize what you are considering the theoretical framework of your particular project. You know, since you're looking at strategic planning, or we're not sure what we're going to call that yet, Anthony, but you would just give a few sentences on that. I hate using the word theory, but that's the word that we use. But the theoretical framework, the concepts that possibly are integral in your project. So, you know, just give a few sentences. This isn't where you're going to go into depth. In the literature review, you're going to go more in depth in terms of the various components of your theoretical framework. But here, you can at least summarize for your reader what are some of the big concepts that seem to relate that you're going to try to integrate into your project. So that's your intent. So, you know, why you're doing the project, just maybe a little summary of the kind of research you're going to need to do, and just a summary of the theoretical framework would be appropriate, I think, for this particular section. The second big section then, and Dr. Henry is going to talk about this in more detail in a minute, but it's the research questions. And again, we're looking for, you know, 3 to 7 questions that you feel you're going to need to answer in order to successfully implement this project. You know, and I just listed what I consider some categories here that I think are important. You know, you may need to ask a question about, you know, the existence and the extent of the defined problem. Okay, you know, how prevalent is the problem of lack of planning in the church community? Okay, and you'd be looking at that through bibliographical and empirical data. Okay, bibliographic, you're looking at articles, journal articles, etc., that have been written on a topic, and then you're going to answer some of that particular research question by the empirical data you collect, by talking to people. You know, you're trying to understand how extensive is the problem? How do people define the problem? How do people, what kinds of issues have been involved in that problem? Okay, and then, you know, the theoretical framework. What do you need to know about a particular area of knowledge in order to have some expertise for the kind of work you're doing? So, you know, you may be asking, just frame a question that talks about what you need to know in terms of the theories. What do you need to know? Again, just framing a question in terms of the theological issues, okay? You can just say, you know, what biblical principles in terms, say, of planning seem to relate to this project? That's a research question, because you're going to be doing research in the literature. And then, you know, finally, we're going to be looking for some kind of a strategy, but just, you know, a general question in terms of, okay, what kinds of practical strategies might be implemented to help churches with their planning? So, I mean, the research questions, at least from my perspective, basically cover what you need to know, what you want to know in terms of theories and principles that you learn through literature, data that you collect through empirical data collecting with people, theological principles that you feel you need to understand a little more in terms of the project that you're working with, and then what kinds of practical solutions are you going to need to start to look at in order to culminate this project. So again, the research questions pretty much frame the whole context, not use that word, but the whole project. Okay, everything needs to relate back to the research questions. Say in the literature review, you're going to probably talk about some of these theoretical frameworks, And in the literature review, you'll probably talk about some of these theological issues. You'll have a section. So in the literature review, you're going to talk a lot about the principles and the theories. In the research methodology section, you're going to get more into how you're going to ask people about the problem, asking people about possible solutions. So, you know, in the research methodology chapter, you're going to deal with more of the empirical side of the research. And so, you know, you maybe have one or two research questions that really help the reader understand what it is you're trying to find out, say, in some of the empirical research. And then finally, the intervention section, which is, you know, every BGU project needs to have a transformational strategy that is kind of the culmination of that project. And I think what we've been trying to emphasize lately, though, is that the transformational strategy needs to grow out of your research. You may have an idea of something you might like to do, you know, a seminar, a city consultation, what it might be. But we ask you to try to go into the research with the idea of what do I need to know here in order to help address this problem? And, you know, try not to have too much of a preconceived idea of what you maybe need to do. So what I said here in this, just in the introduction chapter, I'm saying in the proposal phase, you may not have a clear idea of the kind of practical strategy you needed to effectively begin to address the problem. Possible strategies should be based on the research that you'll do by communicating with people about the issues. At this point, you may indicate some possible strategies you're thinking about with the indication that the actual strategies will emerge from the research, okay? And I just put down, you know, some of the possible strategies that students have used in the past, you know, seminars, workshops, city consultations, testing out a curriculum, asset-based community development approaches, et cetera. You know, those are examples of the kinds of intervention strategies that a dissertation might culminate in. Okay, that's just kind of a very brief summary from my perspective about the purpose statement. Anything that you'd want to ask about that before we kind of let Dr. Henry go into a little more in-depth on some of the research question and issues? Okay, well, let's do that. And I think there may be more questions as we get into the content that Dr. Henry will present to us. So, Dr. Henry?
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, we're going to be looking at the issue of formulating the research question, which is foundational to your study. And I just want to commend you for the quality of the discussion that you did last week, and to remind you that that is just the beginning phase. But I was encouraged by your diligence, and also many of you shared resources with your colleagues that would be helpful. So I appreciated that. Formulating the research question. This is foundational. And because it's foundational, it usually takes more time than you might anticipate. However, it's important that you take the time because it's the foundation. And if you start off asking the wrong questions, then your study is going to be as weak as the questions that you have asked. So let's look at some of the fundamental issues. The goal is for us to understand why we develop academic research questions and to consider strategies for developing these questions. So you begin by formulating your own research questions, but of course you don't do that. You don't just pull it out of thin air. The kinds of questions you are going to formulate will be grounded in your own interest and concern, and also in your knowledge. We talked earlier about theoretical framework, in your knowledge about the academic studies that surround the issue that you would like to address. Why create research questions? First of all, there is just the basic curiosity that we have about situations, about organizations, about processes. So our research questions are usually grounded in our curiosity. Research is defined as the diligent and systematic inquiry or investigation into a subject in order to discover or revise facts, theories, applications, etc. So research is about discovery, and foundational to it is the issue of the theories that underline your research. And theories are important because theories explain phenomenon, they explain situations, and they also predict. So the theory and the research questions are foundational issues that we need to understand as we proceed. Consider together, curiosity is the source of our questions. We ask because we want to know, and the research is the means by which we find an answer. And here I just want to point out that sometimes people approach research as though they already have the answer, and they are looking for justification for the answers that they have. That's poor research. Research should be an open-ended inquiry whereby you are looking to find the answers. And so you're prepared to follow the information and knowledge wherever it may lead you. It may be that when you do the research, the answers that you get from the research do not match the assumptions with which you came into the research. That's fine. And that is why at the beginning of the research, you have to be able to identify the assumptions underlying your study. What it is that you believe about the situation, about the relationships of the variables. If it's a quantitative study, those are assumptions. And one of the things we do too in research is that we test assumptions. And when you test assumptions, the assumption becomes a hypothesis. And in quantitative research studies, we are testing assumptions by identifying the hypotheses that underline our studies. In academic work, we formulate clear questions to guide us in our search for answers, but we don't skew the questions to give us the answers we want. So it's important that the questions be open-ended questions. Okay. So a research question is something you want to know about your discipline or about a specific area within your discipline or about an organization or about processes within an organization, etc. Basic to the research question is you want to know, you do not know. It is not a topic, a fragment, a phrase, or a sentence. It's a question, so it ends with a question mark. That, of course, is basic, but don't take it for granted. Because sometimes what people do is they take a statement and then they try to put a question mark at the end of a statement. But what they're making is a statement. They're not asking a question. The research question must be clear and precisely stated. It is not too broad, neither is it too narrow. It is open-ended as opposed to closed, and it cannot be answered in a sentence or phrase. Personal knowledge and the research question. This presenter suggests that at the beginning of the process to identify your question, start off with a list of your interests. What are your interests in terms of strategic planning? What are your interests in terms of parenting and the impact of parenting on children's emotional, spiritual, psychological development? But start with your interests, and of course, each of you has identified the interests that you have. Consider one of the items on your list, jot down everything you know about that topic as quickly as possible. So you're basically doing a brainstorming. Now find the answers to the following questions in your free write. And these are our basic questions: who, what, when, where, why, how, so what, and what if. Those are good questions that you should be thinking about as you seek answers to the interests that you have. These represent possible gaps in your knowledge. The last four are particularly tough: the why, the how, the so what, and the what if. They are tough because they are open-ended. However, they are good because they lead to good research questions. So you continue steps 2 and 3 above with each item on your initial list, the list that you've brainstormed, until you have found an open-ended question that you would like to answer. The secondary sources and the research questions. Read. Having had a preliminary interest, and having listed your brainstorm, your interests, the next step is to read research on what you are interested in. And of course, the emphasis is on research, because that's the context in which we are doing our work. Read the academic and professional papers out there about the topic. And one of the maxims we use in research is we say, start with the latest research material that is out there. In every discipline, there are classic pieces that go way back in the 1930s, etc., even in the 1920s, and that is fine. But research is dynamic, and somebody may have studied an issue 10 years ago and found certain things, and then somebody may have studied that same issue a year ago and the findings may be different. So you want to start with the latest research articles as you start to browse, to come to an understanding about this issue in which you're interested. After you have read, then try doing the strategy, the first strategy we talked about in terms of brainstorming your interest. As you read, you may find that the original interest that you had has changed as a result of what you've read in the literature. As you read, you may find that some of the questions that you thought were good questions are not as good as you think they are, and you may make changes. You will make changes as a result of reading the research literature. What you want to guard against is to come to the process with your mind made up. So what you do, what people do, is that they come to the process to find the answers that they already think they have about the issue. You can't do that. You have to be open to the possibility that the assumptions that you started out with are not the correct ones as such. Modes of thought and the research question. Consider the rhetorical modes we use when we organize our ideas in speaking or writing. We may use a comparison and contrast approach. We may look at process. We may try to classify our findings. We may look for cause and effect. Cause and effect is usually tricky in research. But that is an approach that you may use once you understand the limitations of the cause and effect approach. Problem and solution. Consider why, how, so what if of each of these modes. Okay. Focusing and supporting research questions. The most important question you discovered from the 3 prior activities. The focusing is very important because as I mentioned in the beginning class, usually when we start off thinking about a research, we usually go very broad. I usually say we want to study the whole world, but the reality is that you could just look at a small piece of that big interest that you have. And for some people, getting to focus in is very frustrating because they think big and they want to do it big as they're thinking. But the reality is that research takes time. And even though in the real world, and Anthony's question earlier was a good question when he talked about whether theoretical framework is singular or plural. It is in reality plural, but again, because we need to focus, you have to be able to identify a limited number of theoretical frameworks that undergird your study. So that was a good question. Okay. So usually in the research, we have what we call the focusing question, the main question of the study, and then we have the supporting questions. These are the questions that will help you to explore the relationship around the focusing question in greater depth. For example, and he gives us an example here, the focusing question: how can the university community increase its economic impact on this particular community? That is the big focusing question. Coming out of that question, you ask a number of questions. How does the university currently impact the community?
Thinking we may have lost Dr. Henry's audio. Is anyone else hearing Dr. Henry? No, it's me.
Come in. Any question, comment? I know it's quite a mouthful.
I just have one, Dr. Henry, and it's more of a process question, I suppose. This feels highly iterative, and how much backtracking is typical in this course as you spiral or funnel toward your final, submittal or proposal? Is there a point of wisdom where you stop pursuing questions, or are there some good clues that you've reached an appropriate level of questioning?
Okay. What do you mean by backtracking?
I'm referring to the you ask a question, you read the literature, you go back and refine your question.
Right.
Backtracking is not a good word, but I guess iterative may be a better word.
Okay.
You're learning, asking. So maybe a comparative question would be, when do you know you've digested literature? What I've read and reading is when you start seeing the same original sources again and again.
Yes.
So is there a clue in the question asking that you've arrived at a good point? And maybe you're coming to that. I don't know.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I would say there's a clue. What I would say is that you want to be clear about your focus question, because that's that's the foundation on which you're building your research. So you must have clarity on that in terms of your own understanding. And of course, you must have clarity in terms of the extent to which you see the literature supporting that particular interest that is framed in your main question, or the term I'm more familiar with is the major question of the study. However, the decision as to when you stop reading and focus, some of that is yours. And as supervisors, we help you to get there, because one of the things you don't want to do, and there's students who are like that, they like to read a lot, which is fine, and they keep reading and they keep reading and they keep refining, but at some point you have to move on. So we are there to help you to focus and move on. I hope that answers the question.
It's helpful, thank you.
Okay. So we've looked at the relationship between the major question of the study, also called the focus question or the main question of the study, and the supporting questions.
Let me just make one comment. This is Bill.
Sure.
And let's see, everybody make sure you mute your microphone when you're not talking. I'm getting echo here. Anyway, the focus, as I understand it, the focus question, and you're basically, if you look at your problem statement, you are asking what it is, in a big way, what it is you are wanting to, the big question you're asking, okay? I keep you, since you were up, Anthony, the big question you're asking about, how are churches doing planning in relationship to the transformative work that they want to do in a community, or something along those lines. It's kind of the big question you're asking. And then you're going to find supporting questions to that in terms of, I don't know, you'd have to even start looking at the topics that you've used as search topics when you've gone to various databases, just those topics. As you keep looking at more and more topics that you're relating to the subject, are going to be part of the supporting questions, I would think. But the focus question is going to be the big question that you're asking, even in relationship to the problem statement.
We'll continue. Remember, as you grow, make your question one that somebody else will want an answer to as well. They will be your audience. So when we do research, we don't just do research for our own benefit and interest. We do have an audience, as was mentioned earlier. And of course, we have a context. And ideally, we hope that our research would be significant, and it would be so significant that others would want to read it. Your purpose is your your purpose is your reason for asking your question. The answer to your research question will be a complete statement expressed as a sentence, and that is called the thesis of your study. If you use a rhetorical mode to formulate your question, you should use that mode to organize the paragraphs of your paper. Now, the going back to the issue of the theoretical foundation of the study, the literature review chapter is where we present the theories, we summarize and present the theories that underlie our study. And one of the ways Dr. Payne just mentioned is to organize that, the subsections in that chapter using the theories that underlie your study. That's one of the better ways to organize your chapter 2, the review of literature. So that's important. Most importantly, do not get discouraged or worried if you find that your thesis or your beliefs change, because this is a natural part of the research and writing process. We cannot overemphasize this. Again, you have to be careful that you don't start the process and lock yourself in such a way that you cannot respond to the research that you're reading and make the necessary changes, because you're in a process of discovery. I call it doing detective work. So yes, you may come into it with certain assumptions, certain convictions about the situation, about the problem, about the organization, about the strategy, but let the literature speak to you, and so be prepared to make changes to your questions. But that's not an everlasting process. At some point, we will help you to nail down your interests in terms of the framing the questions, and then you move on from there. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, we end with the references to this presentation. I'll stop sharing.
Let me just emphasize one issue that I know comes up often, and I think Dr. Henry mentioned it. A research question should not be, see, I'm getting an echo. Anyway, a research question should not be a yes/no question. Okay, try to frame that question in such a way that it's open-ended. So I think that is an important issue. Okay, any other issues? I just had a logistical issue here. Someone on the screen is the identifier is Dell, D-E-L-L. Who might that be? What I'm thinking is it is just taking the name of the computer and put it on the as an identifier. Anyway, I was just trying to determine who's all in the Zoom room right now.
It's Steve, but maybe Claire, when you don't speak, turn your mic off to see if it helps.
Ah, that may be the issue. Anyway, I was trying to determine, someone on the screen just has the name Dell. Does anybody relate to who that might be? I'm going to just unmute that person right now.
It's Steve, I believe.
That is Steve, just he has no audio. There was a message in the chat room.
Oh, okay, so that's Steve.
He has no audio. It's Steve.
All right, good. All right, that's good to know. Thank you. Okay, any other questions, issues? Sometimes what I recommend, and like I said, we'll put this PowerPoint on research questions into the classroom. I'll put it on the lesson page for week 3 under the files area. I really recommend you look through that PowerPoint. You know, look at as that PowerPoint presents some of the ways to formulate a research question. You know, asking, what, where, when, why, how, what if. you look at those slides and then look at the instruction sheet for the week on purpose statement, which is kind of more of a general overview, and then try to, just start thinking along those lines. If you're thinking, the first point I think on the instruction sheet was, you're thinking about the problem statement, what the issue is, how extensive is it, what are some of the contributing factors to that. You can ask, what, why, when, where, what if. You could ask some of those kinds of questions as you're formulating, say, even a big question about the problem that you're working with. Okay, if you're looking at, say, some theological research questions, what principles, what biblical principles seem to give some perspective, some light on this particular issue. Okay, so I think it'll become, at least for me, it always becomes more clear as I'm working with an example. So as you're putting, you're working on your purpose statement and you submit it for the week, both I and Dr. Henry can kind of give you some feedback on that, to possibly ways to, refine the question, expand the question, various ways to help you in that research question process. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we're going to go ahead and close down this session for today. I appreciate the work you're doing, and I'm watching what you're doing in the discussion rooms, and that's a good place just to keep clarifying some of these issues, okay? I think this week you are looking at some research questions and how you apply the word theory. And again, and I've noticed in the discussion room, people have still used that word theory as a hypothesis. Remember, we're not using the word theory as a hypothesis in this context. A theory is a set of principles or concepts that have been accepted and are useful in framing a particular issue or predicting, or what there's various verbs that are used in terms of what a theory does. Okay, so don't confuse the word theory with hypothesis. Okay, and I saw several in the discussion room kind of giving me hypotheses as opposed to a set of principles that relate to your particular topic. All right. I will also put the link that Dr. Martin put up in terms of worldview. I've got that, and I will put that in the link section. I haven't looked at that yet, but I think there may be some good required reading we should just have us all do in that section. So I'll take a look at that and post that link in the classroom under the link section on week 3. All right, this session has been recorded, so we will have you be able to look through this recording again and possibly get pieces that maybe you missed. And again, the PowerPoint, I'll have Dr. Henry go ahead and put the PowerPoint presentation in the week 3 files area also. Okay, with that, I think we'll end the meeting and just pray that we can keep working together on these various problem statements and purpose statements as we work through the assignment this week. All right. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.